Palomares Incident. In January 1966, a routine U.S. Air Force mission over Spain ended in one of the most serious nuclear accidents of the Cold War. A B-52 bomber carrying 4 hydrogen bombs was flying near the Spanish coast as part of Operation Chrome Dome, the continuous airborne alert designed to keep nuclear weapons ready at all times. To complete its long mission, the bomber had to refuel in midair from a KC-135 tanker. As the two aircraft connected at 31,000 feet, a collision occurred. The refueling boom struck the bomber, tearing open its fuselage. Both planes burst into flames in the sky above the Mediterranean. The KC-135 disintegrated instantly, killing its crew, while the B-52 broke apart and rained debris over the countryside and sea. The 4 hydrogen bombs it carried were thrown from the wreckage. 3 fell near the fishing village of Palomares, while the 4th landed in the waters of the Mediterranean. 2 of the bomb's conventional explosives detonated on impact, scattering plutonium dust across the fields and contaminating the soil. Farmers who had been working in the area suddenly found their land glowing with radiation monitors as American troops moved in to secure the crash site. The U.S. military launched a massive recovery effort. Thousands of American personnel were deployed to Spain, combing the countryside for radioactive fragments. The contaminated soil was shoveled into barrels and shipped across the Atlantic to be buried in South Carolina. For weeks, teams searched the seafloor for the missing 4th bomb. Using submarines, sonar, and even advice from a local fisherman who had seen the bomb fall, the Navy eventually located the weapon nearly 3 months later at a depth of over 2,000 feet. Although no nuclear detonations occurred, the release of plutonium created long-term environmental and political consequences. The incident shocked the Spanish government, which had permitted the U.S. to station bombers over its territory, and raised alarm internationally about the dangers of airborne nuclear patrols. Operation Chrome Dome was scaled back in the years that followed, as the risks of constant flights with armed hydrogen bombs became clear. Mars Bluff Incident. In March 1958, the quiet community of Mars Bluff, South Carolina, became the site of one of the most unusual nuclear accidents in American history. A U.S. Air Force B-47 Stratojet bomber was flying from Hunter Air Force Base on a training mission when a mistake inside the aircraft set off a chain of events that could have ended in disaster. The bomber was carrying a Mark 6 nuclear bomb, a weapon with a yield of several megatons, as part of the standard practice of keeping nuclear arms ready for rapid deployment during the Cold War. At approximately 4 in the afternoon, the crew was ordered to conduct a routine check of the bomb racks. In the cramped space of the aircraft, a crew member accidentally pulled the emergency release pin. To his shock, the bomb was freed from its harness and fell straight through the bomb bay doors. The bomb did not contain its nuclear core, which was stored separately, but the device was still packed with several thousand pounds of conventional explosives used to trigger the atomic reaction. When the bomb struck the Earth near the Gregg family home in Mars Bluff, the explosives detonated. The blast tore open a crater 70 feet wide and 30 feet deep, flattening the family's house, destroying a playhouse in the backyard, and throwing debris across the neighborhood. Windows shattered for miles, and 6 members of the family were injured by the explosion, though none were killed. News of the accident spread quickly. Residents believed that a nuclear strike had taken place on American soil. Military investigators rushed to the site to secure the debris and calm fears. They confirmed that the nuclear capsule had not been installed, and therefore the risk of a nuclear detonation had been impossible. Yet, the detonation of the conventional explosives was more than enough to demonstrate how fragile the safety measures were. Petrov Incident. In September 1983, the world came closer to nuclear war than most people realized, and the decision of a single officer determined the outcome. Tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union were already at a peak. At a secret command center outside Moscow, Lieutenant Colonel Stanislav Petrov was the duty officer on watch. In the middle of the night, alarms sounded across the bunker. The computer screen showed that a U.S. missile was inbound. Within minutes, the system upgraded its warning, identifying several more missiles. Standard procedure required Petrov to report the attack immediately to his superiors, a step that would likely have triggered a Soviet retaliatory strike. Petrov hesitated. The system was new and untested, and the attack pattern seemed strange. The screen showed only a handful of missiles, not the hundreds that would be expected in a real first strike. Trusting his instincts, Petrov judged that the warning was a false alarm and chose not to escalate. For long minutes, he and his staff waited in silence, watching the countdown. No explosions came. The screens eventually cleared, confirming that the warning had been wrong. Later investigations revealed that the early warning satellites had mistaken the reflection of sunlight on high-altitude clouds for the heat signature of missile launches. The system had nearly set off a chain of decisions that could have unleashed global nuclear war. Petrov's action was never widely recognized in his lifetime. His superiors reprimanded him for failing to follow procedure, and the incident remained classified for years. Yom Kippur War. In October 1973, the Middle East once again became the flashpoint of a global confrontation. On Yom Kippur, the holiest day of the Jewish calendar, Egyptian and Syrian forces launched a surprise attack against Israel. Within hours, the war escalated into a conflict that threatened to draw in both superpowers of the Cold War. As Israeli defenses faltered in the opening days, the country's leadership faced the possibility of national defeat, and in desperation, it quietly prepared its nuclear arsenal. Israel had never officially acknowledged its possession of nuclear weapons, but by 1973, it had assembled a small stockpile of deliverable warheads. As Egyptian troops crossed the Suez Canal and Syrian tanks pressed into the Golan Heights, Defense Minister Moshe Dayan warned that the state itself might not survive. Under conditions of extreme secrecy, Israel placed several nuclear-capable Jericho missiles on standby and readied aircraft that could deliver atomic bombs. The move was designed not only as a last resort, but also as a signal to Washington that Israel's survival was at stake. The United States recognized the danger immediately. If Israel resorted to nuclear weapons, the Soviet Union, which was supplying Egypt and Syria, might respond with its own arsenal. To prevent the conflict from spiraling out of control, the U.S. rushed supplies of conventional weapons to Israel and raised its own nuclear forces to a higher alert. Strategic Air Command placed bombers on standby, and American warships in the Mediterranean were prepared for escalation. For several tense days, the world stood closer to nuclear confrontation than at any time since the Cuban Missile Crisis. As Israeli forces regained the initiative and pushed back against the Arab armies, the nuclear preparations were scaled down. The weapons remained unused, but the crisis left a lasting imprint. NORAD moon mistake. In October 1960, the United States came close to launching a nuclear response over what turned out to be a trick of light in the night sky. At the height of Cold War tension, the North American Aerospace Defense Command, or NORAD, relied on a growing network of early warning radars to detect any sign of a Soviet missile strike. On the night of October 5th, the system reported something extraordinary. Radars in Greenland and Alaska picked up what appeared to be dozens of intercontinental ballistic missiles rising over the horizon. Alarms spread across command centers, and for a brief moment, it looked as though the Soviet Union had begun a nuclear attack. The military scrambled to verify the threat. In Washington, officials were prepared to alert President Eisenhower that the nation was under attack. Strategic Air Command readied bombers for immediate takeoff, while missile crews stood by for launch orders. But as officers studied the radar data more carefully, the apparent missile wave did not match the expected speed or trajectory of a real attack. The explanation that emerged was almost unbelievable. The system's radars had mistaken the rising moon over Norway for incoming missiles. The angle of the radar beams, atmospheric conditions, and the moon's appearance above the horizon combined to create a false signal that looked to the computers like the heat signatures of dozens of Soviet rockets. Within minutes, the error was identified, and the alert was canceled. The bombers remained on the ground, and the missiles stayed in their silos. Operation Goldsboro. In January 1961, a U.S. Air Force B-52 bomber broke apart in the sky over North Carolina while carrying two Mark 39 hydrogen bombs. The aircraft had been on a routine flight when a fuel leak caused it to lose control. As the plane disintegrated, the crew ejected and both nuclear weapons were released over American soil. Each bomb carried a yield of more than 2 megatons, over 200 times the power of the weapon used at Hiroshima. One of the bombs drifted down under its parachute and struck farmland near the town of Faro. The second plunged into a swamp and broke apart, burying components deep in the ground. When investigators examined the weapons, they discovered how close the country had come to disaster. On one of the bombs, 5 of the 6 arming mechanisms had already been activated. Only a single low-voltage safety switch prevented detonation. If that switch had failed, a nuclear explosion would have destroyed much of eastern North Carolina, and radioactive fallout would have spread across the eastern United States. The Air Force classified the details for decades, but later reports confirmed the scale of the danger. Portions of one weapon remain unrecovered, encased in the soil near the crash site. The Goldsboro incident became one of the most alarming nuclear near misses in history, a moment when the United States came within a breath of annihilating part of its own territory with its own weapons. Titan II missile incident. In September 1980, the United States came within moments of a nuclear catastrophe not because of enemy action, but because of a simple accident inside one of its own missile silos. At Damascus, Arkansas, a U.S. Air Force crew was conducting routine maintenance on a Titan II intercontinental ballistic missile. The Titan II was one of the largest missiles ever deployed, standing 103 feet tall and carrying a 9-megaton nuclear warhead, the most powerful ever placed on active alert by the United States. During the inspection, a technician working on the missile dropped a heavy socket wrench. The tool fell down the silo and punctured the missile's thin metal skin, tearing open a pressurized fuel tank. The Titan II used a volatile combination of hypergolic propellants that ignited on contact. With fuel vapor filling the silo, the situation quickly spiraled into crisis. Emergency teams rushed to contain the leak, but every effort carried the risk of triggering an explosion that could destroy the missile and detonate its nuclear warhead. By the early morning of September 19th, the pressure inside the silo could no longer be contained. The fuel ignited in a massive explosion that tore the silo apart. Concrete and steel were blasted hundreds of feet into the air, and debris rained across the Arkansas countryside. One airman was killed and more than 20 others were injured in the blast. The nuclear warhead was blown clear of the silo and hurled several hundred feet away. By sheer luck, the arming mechanisms did not activate and the weapon did not detonate. Recovery teams later found it lying intact in a ditch. If the warhead had exploded with its full 9-megaton yield, much of Arkansas would have been annihilated, and radioactive fallout would have spread across the central United States. Suez crisis. In late 1956, the Middle East became the stage for a confrontation that nearly drew the superpowers into direct conflict, and for the first time, nuclear weapons were openly part of the calculations. The crisis began in July when Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal, the vital waterway that carried much of Europe's oil supply. Britain and France, which had controlled the canal for decades, saw the move as a direct challenge to their power. In secret, they joined with Israel in a plan to overthrow Nasser and regain control of the canal. In late October, Israeli forces invaded the Sinai Peninsula, advancing rapidly toward the canal. British and French forces followed with airstrikes and landings, presenting the operation as a move to separate the combatants, but in reality, aiming to seize the canal zone. The attack shocked the world. For the Soviet Union, which supported Egypt, it looked like a return to colonial conquest. For the United States, it was an embarrassment, undermining Washington's effort to present itself as the leader of the free world against communism. As fighting raged, Moscow escalated the stakes. On November 5th, Soviet Premier Nikolai Bulganin sent messages to London, Paris, and Tel Aviv, threatening to use modern rockets to strike their cities unless they withdrew from Egypt. The language was widely interpreted as a direct nuclear threat. Soviet bombers were placed on alert, and rumors spread that missiles might already be aimed at Western Europe. For Britain and France, who were already under pressure from Washington to halt the invasion, the Soviet warning carried a new and terrifying weight. The United States responded cautiously but decisively. President Dwight Eisenhower opposed the invasion and demanded a withdrawal, while at the same time raising the readiness of U.S. nuclear forces to deter any Soviet strike. Strategic Air Command went on heightened alert, and American carriers moved closer to the Mediterranean. For several tense days, the world feared that a local war over the Suez Canal might spiral into the first nuclear exchange between East and West. Diplomatic pressure soon forced an end to the crisis. Britain, France, and Israel withdrew, while Egypt emerged with control of the canal intact. The Soviet threats were never acted upon, but the episode showed how regional conflicts in the nuclear age could escalate instantly to the global level. Thank you so much for watching this video, and if you learned something, make sure to leave a like. Subscribe if you would like to see similar videos. Thank you again, and goodbye.